Welcome, everybody. My name is Gregory Pfeiffer. I am the director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. Thank you very much for coming tonight when you could be protesting in front of the Capitol against possible firing of Robert Mueller. 10 years ago, I was an NPR reporter in Moscow and just finishing a book about the Soviet war in Afghanistan. That's just about the time that President Obama was announcing that he was going to ramp up the US-led campaign in Afghanistan. It was also the time when US-Russia relations were rapidly deteriorating, and a lot of the Soviet veterans to whom I was speaking were eager to see the US fail. In fact, the the US conflict, the new conflict, was added to the slights that the Russians felt that the Americans were committing against Moscow. We know Afghanistan far better than anyone else, and no one is consulting us, which really seemed absurd on the face of it to me at the time. The Soviet Union was blinkered by communist ideology. They became involved in a bitter civil war that they had no idea what was really going on from beginning to end. A lot of the soldiers to whom I spoke, and especially the ones who were going there in the beginning of the conflict, earnestly believed the propaganda that they would be fighting American soldiers in Afghanistan in 1979. But above all, the Soviet war machine was a total shambles. It was crippled by hazing, drinking, and drugs. And the worst thing was that there weren't enough provisions provided for the Soviet personnel, so that they had to raid supplies from local Afghans, which is not a great way to win hearts and minds. 30 years later, US troops were far better equipped and trained. They had regular surf and turf menus in their mess halls. They were much better versed in the theory of counterinsurgency warfare. How could the two campaigns possibly be compared? Thankfully, I don't have to answer that question. John Caldwell can. In his new book, Anatomy of Victory, he addresses the deep roots of the American failure on the battlefield in the past several decades. And he addresses how to address it. John retired in 2007 after a 50-year career in defense think tanks and aerospace companies. He trained as a political scientist, with a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He was first posted to Saigon in 1968 as part of a classified research project for the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency. He joined TRW Space and Defense in 1982 to work on major defense, NASA, and intelligence community programs, and he remains an active consultant at Northrop Grumman Aerospace Systems. Joining John is Jeffrey Race, right here, a former fellow of the Institute of Current World Affairs in Southeast Asia, who is a US Army veteran and author of War Comes to Long On, the canonical analysis of why the US effort in Vietnam failed. He attended Harvard University before being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the US Army's Signal Corps. He returned to Southeast Asia as an independent researcher in South Vietnam and Thailand before going back to Harvard to complete his PhD. Jeffrey has spent most of his life outside the US working as a management consultant, professor, and research scholar. Our third panelist, Hashim Bhattacharya, is the program director of the Institute of Current World Affairs. He's also been a fellow at the Asia Society since 2012, and Hashim served as spokesman and senior program officer of the United Nations Regional Program for Afghanistan and neighboring countries for almost a decade. He's an Afghan analyst on foreign policy and counterterrorism, as well as a frequent commentator in print, radio, and television. His opinion pieces have appeared in the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, BBC, and other major outlets. And moderating is Laura Brown. She serves as the director of the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University. A distinguished writer and dedicated scholar, Brown is the author of Jockeying for the American Presidency, the Political Opportunism of Aspirants, the first systematic study of presidential aspirants from the 1790s through 2008. Before returning to academia in 2004, she worked as an education policy and public affairs consultant in Silicon Valley and Los Angeles. She also served as a notable appointee in President Bill Clinton's administration at the U.S. Department of Education. So before I hand off to Laura, I'll just say that there are copies of John's new book in front for sale, as well as Jeffrey's, and both will be available for signing, I hope. And I also ask that you please mute your cell phones. Thanks very much.
Thank
Laura.
you. So thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight, to be with such distinguished panelists here and authors, but also a really tremendous audience full of individuals who have studied and executed and been involved in so many aspects of our foreign and military policy. It's just a delight to have a chance to be here this evening. I also want to take a moment of personal privilege to say, I'm not sure if we have any students from the Daniel Morgan Graduate School, but the invitation was put out to them. And for those of you who don't know, they are close partners with us at the Graduate School of Political Management at GW, and we are encouraging them to learn more about so many of these topics that we'll get into tonight. So I think the first place to start is, where did this book begin? It is so very important, I think, to understand why an author came to the subject that they came to, and how it became important in their life, important enough to write a book about it. So first, let me say congratulations. John, it is a tremendous accomplishment. Your book is extraordinary. And I'm sure you and Jeff will enjoy this sort of reminiscence.
Well, thank you. In March of 1968, my first real job began in Saigon, actually. And I was working for a company in Goleta, California called General Research Corporation. They had a contract with the Advanced Research Projects Agency, I think a sole source contract. If there are people in this audience who know about Pentagon procurement, I don't know quite how that happened, but it did. And I was part of a research team of about 9 people. My boss was a retired Marine Corps colonel with a Silver Star from the Chosin Reservoir operation. So he had a certain amount of credibility with the MACV types that we quickly met when we arrived in Saigon. A week into this experience, I meet this gentleman sitting on my left, Jeffrey Race, and the conversation begins with, why are you here, what are you doing? And I figured out that he had come back to Vietnam as a civilian, was hoping to get some kind of a stipend, I think, from the State Department, maybe wandered through the CIA, it wasn't clear, but he hadn't gotten it yet. And we were sort of chatting, and of course I was thinking, maybe we ought to hire this guy as a consultant to help us. He seems to know a lot more about what's going on here than I seem to. And then he says to me, John, we're going to lose this war. And I said, my God, Jeffrey, how can you make a statement like that? I mean, look around you. We've got military bases all around the Saigon area. We've got 550,000 people here. We've got aircraft carriers offshore that can fly to any point in the country 24/7. We've got 1,700 aircraft dedicated to the theater. How could we lose? I mean, even if the shooting were to stop tomorrow. And by the way, we were losing 350 men a week there. If the shooting were to stop tomorrow, it would take us 5 years to pack up and go home. There's so much stuff here. And he just levelly looks at me straight in the eye and says, John, our enemies have a theory of victory, and we don't. It was that simple. And that has stuck with me for 50 years. And so when I retired after this long career as a certifiable member, I guess, of the military-industrial complex, that's what Jeffrey accuses me of being, and I gleefully and happily accept that description. I decided that I wanted to write a book that asked this question: why did the United States triumph in World War II? Thinking that that was a benchmark of some kind. Fight to a stalemate in Korea, lose in Iraq, lose in Vietnam, and fail in Iraq. And I thought if I could dig into the historical record, I might be able to make some sense of it. And I further thought, I had been reading books about warfare and conflict all of my life. Even though as somebody with a political science PhD, I never thought of myself as trained to do anything I did in terms of having a real job that actually paid me money. And I discovered I liked the intellectual company of scientists and engineers a lot better than I did fellow social scientists in the late 1960s. But I learned so much from having had this experience that is what in fact gave me the confidence to think I might be able to address this question in a systematic way against a common framework. Does that sort of start it off?
I think it does. I think, Jeff, I'm just curious, what was your reaction in that first meeting and in these
I don't remember it.
conversations?
I discovered it. I told John, please don't mention me in the preface. And he said, well, I'd have to, because you're the reason I wrote the book. I only found out after we finished the book.
Well, that's fantastic.
Well, with me, it was burned into rock. So then I started wondering, how was I going to do this? What made World War II a benchmark? I mean, we've all read, I assume, looking around this audience, I suspect many of you have read books on World War II. They're big sellers, much more so than some of the other conflicts I've named. In fact, the Library of Congress has a literature, the number of books is something on the order of 200,000. So it's a big, substantial collection in multiple languages. And I thought, well, if I dig into World War II, how am I going to do it? I need some kind of framework in which to look at this. And I came up with the idea of a strategic architecture, kind of a phrase that fell out of the word architecture when engineers talk about the architecture of a major defense program, for example. If you've ever been around Silicon Valley types, you occasionally will hear people talk about hardware architectures or software architectures, and they draw sophisticated looking block diagrams, and you can sort of get a sense that, well, maybe this is an architecture or a blueprint for something. Or just talking to an architect who builds things. And so I thought, well, what might be the components of this in a geopolitical sense? And to me, it really came down to three things. The interaction of policy, strategy, and operations, where policy is what statesmen and sometimes generals do when they are trying to define some kind of geopolitical goal that they want to get to, like winning a war, for example. Strategy is assembling the ends and means and getting them into some kind of an alignment so you can achieve the goal. And operations, of course, are what statesmen and generals do once they develop plans and then start executing. And these three elements, if you want to think of it that way, these three domains have to be in some kind of an alignment, meaning proportion with one another. So that if you were someone like Winston Churchill who gets appointed Prime Minister on May 10th in 1940, how are you going to do this? Because he, 3 days later, walks into the House of Commons and says to the members of the House, what is our policy? Our policy is to wage war on land, sea, and air with all our might. And then he rattles on with some more bellicose-sounding phraseology like that about how dreadful Hitler was and how dark the world would become if Hitler succeeded. And then he says, what is our goal? It is victory. For without victory, there is no survival. He said that on May 13th. That same day, the Germans invade the Low Countries, and within a few days, it looks like the whole Western Front is collapsing, and the British are going to be pushed, as they were a few weeks later, less than a month later, to the beaches at Dunkirk. And Churchill shows up in the house again about 2 weeks after that. This is now roughly June 4th. And he's talking about, half a dozen countries either already being overrun or on the verge of being overrun. And again, kind of the defiant talk and the idea that a new dark age might be falling upon Europe, not to mention Britain herself. And then again, there's after the Battle of after the Battle of France has been fought, and it appears to be lost, let another week pass. It's now June 18th. He says to the House again, the third famous speech, we shall never surrender. We're going to fight at the beaches. We're going to fight on the landing grounds. We're going to fight in the hills. We're going to fight in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. This is a man using the language of defiance. But at that time, I don't think he had a clue what a strategic architecture was for winning the war. But he knew a few things that did matter. And he communicated this over the succeeding months and weeks of the summer of 1940 fairly convincingly, I thought. We've all read accounts of this. But what seemed extraordinary to me was in the speech on June 18th, the Battle of France is over, and I think the Battle of Britain is about to begin. And he actually welcomed it, because he knew a few things that few of his countrymen did. For example, that the RAF fighter command was actually the best fighter force in the world. They had 2 state-of-the-art aircraft, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. They were equivalent to the German Me-109, and they had enough of them so that they could probably, in the air, performance-wise, match the Me-109 and against German pilots. There was nothing particularly unique about the pilots on either side. They were roughly equivalent in terms of competence. If anything, the British were a little more amateurish, but they learned their deadly business, at least the ones who were successful, pretty fast. And he also knew one other thing, that the Royal Navy outnumbered the German Kriegsmarine 10-1 in capital ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all of that. And realized that the Germans were going to have a tough time getting across the English Channel if they wanted to invade England. Because he said in the June 18th speech, Hitler knows he's going to have to break us in this island or lose the war. So how does he talk to the guys who were running the RAF? He said, what you guys need to do is fight the Luftwaffe to a standstill. In other words, winning by not losing. And he spent those first several months of his leadership, which was inspired leadership, convincing the people he was working with, as well as his countrymen, that we could fight the Germans to a standstill and survive as a viable combatant and await events. Little did he know that 13 months later, Hitler, frustrated because he couldn't win the Battle of Britain, was looking for another soft target. And he thought it was going to be Russia. The Russians will think a hurricane hit them. Or Goebbels saying, it's going to all collapse like a house of cards. And little did Hitler realize that he too had a strategic architecture that was fatally flawed. even though nobody really knew it at the time, except maybe some of the smarter planning officers inside the German army, the Wehrmacht, probably did understand it. And he had this notion that, I'm going to knock off Russia quickly, and then I'll be able to deal with Britain from a real position of strength. And I'll recover from Goering having failed to win the Battle of Britain. And of course, none of those things happened the way Hitler thought of it. In fact, despite his reading of Clausewitz multiple times, I think he forgot the most important sentence of all. No statesman, if he has his senses, ever begins a war without having a clear idea of what it is that he wants to accomplish and some realistic concept for how he was going to achieve. So I started working through a whole series, actually 10 battles or campaigns that, in my mind, would explain the outcome of World War II in a military diplomatic sense. Things like the Battle of Britain, which I've started to describe, then the Battle of the Atlantic, which went on through all of the years of the war, all 6 years, even into the final weeks. The invasion of Russia and what that meant. The fight in the desert and the El Alamein battle, which Churchill knew he had to win. And then we come sort of to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and within 6 months to the day, the Battle of Midway is fought, and a few American aviators succeed in sinking 4 of the 6 carriers that attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Extraordinary upset, where events turned in a way that could not possibly have been predicted. And we then get Admiral King and Nimitz both being fairly aggressive and wanting to exploit this advantage, because now the naval initiative was starting to shift a bit. I mean, the Imperial Japanese Navy was still formidable, but not capable of quite of the expansion they thought they were going to be capable of, and they were rushing to get to Guadalcanal. But we got there in some ways first and pushed them off the airfield, and then a long 7-month battle was fought on a shoestring. Well, I'm getting into too many details here, but I'm sort of walking you through a sequence of things that happened in World War II, battles or campaigns that we either, as allies together, either had to win or couldn't afford to lose.
So John, let me just ask you to hone in on one thing that you touched but didn't really explain, because I think it's an important part of your strategic architecture and the book in general. This leadership difference between, say, Churchill and Hitler or other individuals throughout. They have this, what you talk about, this sort of sense of the end game, or the front-back planning, or the back-to-front planning. Maybe you could describe a little of how Churchill, as this kind of archetype of a leader, kind of moves from one to another, but certainly gets to this reverse engineering when he is able.
Well, let me introduce a couple of more leaders, because I think they play a role in this too. If you're going to get into a conflict like this, you have to think it through to the end. What is the end state? Well, if it's victory, as Churchill told the House of Commons, what does that end state look like? Well, what that end state really started looking like was the destruction of Germany's 60 largest cities, Japan's 60 largest cities, and defeat of their armies and navies. That's ultimately what it meant. And it was a long war where we mobilized everything and fought it globally. But we thought about something else. What is going to happen when we win? What are we going to do then? This is the end game, where as early as January of 1941, George Marshall, remember him? He sends a delegation of guys to Cambridge University to start working on a field manual for military government. And what the U.S. Army was going to be doing behind the front with taking over and operating within the areas that they were going to set out to conquer. And so they started developing this manual in considerable detail, and it went on throughout the war, and eventually we started developing collegial apparati like the Cossack organization that eventually became SHAPE, scores and scores of committees that were established between ourselves and the British and the French, the Poles, some Russian participation, thinking through what kind of an international system did we want to see emerge after we succeeded in winning World War II. Because these men all had pretty high confidence that we were going to win the war. We were going to do whatever it took to get to where we were eventually in May of 1945, initially with the E-Day, and then August, September of 1945 with VJ Day. We were ready to move with what? Well-planned, well-financed, skillfully executed military occupations and rebuilding programs that lasted longer than the war itself. And in some research that's been done where there are present value calculations on the dollars spent, these were numbers approaching $846 billion. I mean, that's pushing $1 trillion in present day dollars. So this was significant in terms of a country, principally us, I think, engaging in not only warfare, but then a program of nation building where we were trying to recreate a different kind of international system, which I submit to you exists to this day. The foundations were laid after those surrender documents were signed and we started implementing these military occupations. Some of it was messy, there was a lot of dispute, but we stayed with it. And you'll remember that George Marshall, was a 5-star general, but he also, after the war, became Secretary of State and made a famous speech at Harvard in 1947, which was about the European Recovery Plan, which rapidly became known as the Marshall Plan. I can remember myself as an Amherst junior traveling to Germany for a summer to work in a pharmaceutical factory in the city of Ludwigshafen and Mannheim, which the 8th Air Force and Bomber Command had leveled. I mean, some of my bosses at this pharmaceutical factory in the Knoll Aktiengesellschaft had been in the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe and showed me photographs of what Mannheim and Ludwigshafen looked like. And here I am showing up 17 years after 1945, when Germany's a mess, and you could hardly tell, wandering around Mannheim, that a war had been fought there. It was extraordinary, the recovery that had been made. And a lot of that was U.S.-led, and this was a period when in Germany, if you were an American, you were welcomed, and they were grateful for the Marshall Plan.
So can I pivot from that to
Sure.
ask Jeffrey to come in here and sort of talk about your analysis of Vietnam and how and why it was so profoundly different and how this becomes so much a part of John's book in talking about Vietnam. What happened if we did this, if we had statesmen and leaders who had end games, if we had alignment, if we had entire strategic architectures and ideas at which it meant, if you're going to fight a war, you better be willing to be there for, 40, 50 years, billions, maybe even $1 trillion in cost. How do we then end up with so much failure with respect to Vietnam?
So the answer is both simple and complex. The simple part of the answer is that the people who conceived the effort in Vietnam had no idea how that place worked. They simply did not understand. talk in scientific terms. It was a black box. They didn't understand the input-output relationships. And so, since they didn't understand how the place worked, that is to say, that society and what were the issues, they did the wrong things in response, and I'll talk about that in a second. And because most of the things they did were violent things, they got into a death spiral because they created more enemies than they did away with. And so it had to come to a bad end, and this is what John says I told him in 1968, that it was just clear that we were up against people who had a very good plan. Okay, and we had no plan. The idea was you just try everything, you know. AID will send everybody, state will send people, CIA, everybody, Army, you know, Air Force, everybody's going to try something. Something has to work eventually. But since they didn't understand what the operational principles were, when they started using violence, they got into a downward spiral. Okay, so what was it that they didn't understand? So this situation in Vietnam was completely different from the situation that John describes about one technical issue, a military issue. So in the kind of situation which John describes, it was, we call it a conventional war. You win this kind of a war by removing, you know, forcing to surrender or capturing or killing or driving away the people who control some territory which is important. And so you would obtain security in that place by putting in enough of your forces to secure what you say. You know, you're looking at a piece of ground, you've got a gun, people have to obey you. That's the conventional definition of security. And that was the idea of security which dominated the US thinking about Vietnam. But the situation in Vietnam was completely different. You have situations of guerrilla warfare, terrorism, you say, how do we secure this place? Okay, then they attack over there, we send the forces over, we don't have enough forces. Security has a completely different meaning in a war like that. Security, because there's a logical contradiction saying, so you'll get security by concentrating forces of violence in one place. But if there's various kinds of random violence or organized violence in many different places, you can't predict them, you can't concentrate your forces everywhere. So there's a logical contradiction in the basis of American military doctrine in a war such as was fought in Vietnam. The way you get security is by having something which in my book I call a sympathetic environment. You have people who will tell you if there are opposition people nearby, they'll give you intelligence, they'll volunteer, they give you financial support, whatever. So it has a completely different meaning, and that was never understood by the American military. Their idea of security is you send forces, but you can't because you just, even with all these divisions we had there, they could not secure the whole country. Okay, so it was a basic failure of understandings, but that's only the first part of it. The bigger part is, and it's the question I ask in my book, and I'll just make it, for those of you who read War and Peace, at one point, the author says, you know, why do 600,000 men march out to war when Napoleon utters certain words? It's a profound question posed in a literary context. And essentially, I asked the same question in Vietnam, a question which was never asked by the deep thinkers at ARPA, like John, nor anybody in the political science profession. Why is a government which has a blank check from the United States, political, military, diplomatic, economic, advice, everything, losing influence over its own people to a group which is led by people wearing sandals made from old tires and with very little external support? Again, it's a profound question. It is a scientific question. It has a scientific answer. The scientific answer is completely trivial. Any sociologist would know the answer. Chester Bernard, the president of the American Telephone Company in 1938, wrote a book about it called The Functions of the Executive. He said you have to motivate people to cooperate with you. Nobody in politics, this was the days of interdisciplinary research, wasn't a big thing. Nobody in political science understood anything about this, but if you read Peter Blau, who's the expert on social exchange theory, it's very easy. You motivate people by offering to have exchanges with them. And the communist forces very carefully analyzed society, each village, each person in the village, to understand what would motivate people. So there were basically three things. I mean, it's the three things people live for. So it's power and wealth, it's income and wealth, it's power, and it's status. And they developed programs. I'll give you just one example. If in the government system, which we supported, in the village it was led by village elders, respected older people, and essentially that was, they were at the peak of their career. And the civil administration from the district level up was by bureaucrats who were sent from Saigon, and you couldn't go from one to the other. But in the communist system, if you were a smart boy, you worked in the local village, you were better, competent, you got promoted up through the system. Same thing in the military. Essentially in the government system, to be an officer, you had to get a particular kind of a degree in order even to go into the officer corps. On the communist side, it was more like officer candidate school. Anybody who was competent could go up through this system. On the land reform, the government had a land reform program. We give you a title deed. That's fine, thank you very much. The communist system was, we will give you the right to operate this land as long as we're here. And if we are defeated, you will lose your land. So it's a very strong series of motivational programs to get people to call. And basically they built up from nothing. And none of these things was ever understood by the government, by their government or our government. And so it had to end badly, because once the United States government came in with the violence program, it had to go into a downward spiral. And the sad thing is, they're still fighting over this thing.
So this then sort of is analyzed by John in this way of, right, there isn't essentially the alignment of these different aspects of strategic architecture, right? There's not this sense of why one fights this war, why it's needed to win it, what it means to win, and then, of course, how you do the winning. I mean, because one of the things that's always struck me about the Vietnam War, and this idea of fighting guerrilla tactics, is that this is how we won the Revolutionary War in the United States. This is what George Washington actually did. So it's always stunning to me that this is not kind of deeply ingrained in us. And you just described how Churchill, for a significant portion of World War II, was essentially doing that in the Battle of Britain, is winning by not losing. And that is a very important concept that is part of what guerrilla tactics often are engaged with. And so I think what's stunning to me is kind of this problem of not being able to see ourselves in other places or outside of what we think we know about the people we're fighting, the place we're fighting, or the power dynamics within the war.
Well, let me put it to you this way.
We will. We're going to just sort of continue this conversation for another 20 minutes, and then we'll do certainly question and answer.
Think about it this way: in the early to mid 1960s, we were the can-do society. Jeffrey and I both came out of that sort of culture when we were high school students and young college students. And our leaders, the ones who had been assigned to deal with Vietnam in a military sense, were very successful World War II officers. Take Westmoreland, for example. He was an artillery officer in World War II. Courageous, extraordinarily so, and somebody capable of considerable initiative. I mean, at one point in Sicily, he had a jeep blown out from under him by a teller mine and continued on. Earlier, at the fight at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, it was his artillery units that moved in and stopped the Germans in one final thrust that kept the entire army from not perishing that had penetrated that far against the Germans. I mean, it was a learning experience for the U.S. Army. So he had had a lot of this kind of experience built around a doctrine that was pretty simple and straightforward. Find, fix, fight, and finish the enemy. I mean, that's what he'd been taught, and that's what every other World War II officer had been taught. And these guys arrived in Vietnam with that same doctrine, the same kind of organization in our military, and knew that it had been validated because they were participants that won World War II. And yet here they are up against an adversary that they didn't fully understand. This was an adversary who was prepared to fight a 30 years war and take whatever casualties were necessary and wait us out until we got frustrated and decided to pack up and go home, which in a sense is kind of what happened. And we were looking for some, by the time the Nixon administration was around, some fake leaves to sort of make that peace with honor, remember that? That a justification for we succeeded and now we can go home, except we hadn't because we didn't realize what kind of a conflict we were in. How does an army like the one we had deployed out there find, fix, fight, and finish an enemy whose language it cannot speak, whose history it doesn't understand, and whose culture it's pretty clueless about? There were individuals, some are in this audience, who understood all of that, but they weren't working at the highest levels in the government. And so we had people who were applying concepts that weren't necessarily going to work in this kind of asymmetric environment where the adversary was not only prepared to wait us out and realized that he had time on his side, but was prepared to take casualties at extraordinary levels. Tens of thousands, I'm talking about. And they knew that if we started taking casualties, which we did by the tens of thousands, we would get tired of it and the American people wouldn't support it. Not without a theory of victory, but what credible theory of victory was there? That we hadn't thought through how it was going to work. Because what was the business that we were in? Jeffrey kind of lays it out in his book. We were in the business of trying to change behaviors of a host nation, the Vietnamese. And yet these were people about whom we understood very little. In a cultural and historical sense. How were we going to motivate them to assume the risk of death? A question Jeffrey posed to me a number of times when we were in Southeast Asia. How do we get people to assume the risk of death who really don't have that strong a personal motivation to do it? And yet our adversaries were prepared to do that at extraordinarily courageous levels of blood and sacrifice. So it was a different kind of conflict, and we really hadn't done the kind of homework that was necessary or given ourselves the kind of preparation that was necessary. And most of all, we couldn't identify a critical national interest that mattered. There was no resource we needed from Vietnam. There was no mineral product we needed. There was talk maybe of offshore oil, but none of that really mattered. There was no strategic national interest. Why were we there? We never could figure out to ourselves what that meant. When I was working on this ARPA project, Cave said to me one day, Caldwell, go over to the U.S. Embassy because we need some kind of a statement. In the chapter, you're going to write about the regional forces and the popular forces are going to get motivated to assume the risk of death. We need some kind of policy statement that the country has about what is the U.S. national interest. So what do? I pull out my theater orders and walk up to the U.S. Embassy and show them this form, signed by, Westmoreland himself with an auto pen, obviously. And I said, look, I've got a secret clearance, I need to know, can you guys pull out of your files a statement of what U.S. policy is in Vietnam. They didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, they were very polite and befuddled, but, you know, they went through an exercise where they were pulling file drawers over, but they could not find a single piece of paper to explain U.S. policy. I thought that was extraordinary. I mean, they were somewhat embarrassed, but they wanted to get me the hell out of the embassy as quickly as possible. And said, Caldwell, go back to your opera compound and think about something else you need to write, but not this. That became a real eye-opener to me, that we didn't have any sort of coherent statement that was compelling. We didn't have a statement at all, much less one that was compelling.
So,
If you can't do that, how are you going to carry a public with you that was already skeptical of this conflict?
so that brings us to today, and I think our third panelist, Ashwin. Your expertise is Afghanistan. Right? Why are we there? What are we doing there? How could there be a strategic architecture or a deeper understanding? This war is now, we're actually an individual almost old enough to vote. It is very difficult when you think 17 years just recently.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are discussing the topic of the why United States lose wars. Coming from Vietnam, now to Iraq, and then now to Afghanistan. Now the question is that, are we winning the war in Afghanistan? Or are we losing the war in Afghanistan? It is the longest war of the United States in the world. 18 years. We discussed the wars from the United States point of view. I believe that we also need to look at these wars from the field and discuss the ground realities. Why we are not successful there, why we are not winning, why we are losing. There are a couple of missteps, unfortunately, made in Afghanistan, which lead all of us, the Afghan government, the international community, not to win the war. A few mistakes are enough to lose the entire war. Doesn't matter how big these mistakes are or how small these mistakes are. First of all, which is very much important from the point of view of Afghanistan, my comments here and observation by no means contradict the dedication, the commitment of the United States international community and the sacrifices that the people in uniform made in my country. But finally, someone has to discuss these mistakes of the United States, international community, the NATO, and the countries of the region in Afghanistan. Technically, the first point, which is very important, is lack of continuity. The US forces, the NATO, international forces, they deploy in Afghanistan. They are there for 7 or 8 months. The first few months, you have to spend to know the culture, to know the area, to know the geography, to know the people that you work with, and how you work with. And then you are productive for a month and 2, and then you are getting ready to pack and come back home. It continued for the past 18 years. At least you have to be there for 2 or 3 years. And then these people come, and new people go. The same scenario continues. That is the first thing. The second thing is that United States going to Afghanistan, one soldier of the United States cost $1 million. Why we are not building the national and local capacities? The Afghan national forces that can address today's challenges and the future challenges. United States cannot be 911 of the country to call and come. Or the United States cannot police the country in the region. How long you want to stay there? You need to have a strong counterparts. You need to build the capacities, arm them, equip them, and provide trainings to the local police and the armed forces. The third point is, unfortunately, the international forces work with notorious elements within the structure. Notorious elements within the political era. And these notorious elements, one way or another, they are affiliated with the terrorists because their interest is in conflict. Their interest is not in peaceful country. They want to continue and prolong this war. They are involved in drug trafficking. They are involved in kidnapping. They are helping the insurgents. In most of the cases, they are bringing the wounded insurgents to the capitals and to the centers to treat them and take them back. And they were funded by the international forces because of the security company they had, because of the squads, and because they were also contractors. Millions and millions of dollars. That is the problem. The other important thing is that we need to define winning of war. What do we mean by winning of war? We need to define that. What I think is that defeating your enemy and then installing a democratic-based government there, and the people to take the lead and have a well-established government there in place, and then you win the war. Other than that, you haven't. In case of Afghanistan, we still have a bad government, unfortunately. The leaders of the country, they are committed, they are dedicated for having a peaceful and developed country. But because of the notorious elements there, the leadership, they do not have the power to tackle this problem. The United States international community need to support the leaders, the current leaders that we have, actively support them. The corruption, that's part of the bad governance. Particularly corruption within the judicial system. Again, the Afghan government does not have that much power to address these issues. They cannot put few ministers into the jail. That would happen when there is a strong support of the international community and the United States in the lead. Particularly the corruption within the judicial system. We need to ask a question ourselves. Why the young generation of the Afghanistan, they are joining the insurgency, they are joining the terrorism, and why they're not standing with the government and international community? Because not all of them, but a lot of the judges within the judicial system, the prosecutors, I can clearly say that they are much more cruel than ISIS. We have a lot of these cases in the country. Last year, the suicide bomber who attacked the Supreme Court, later on, she was identified that she was a woman, and she was a complainant herself, and she had a case, and she was a victim. And the judges decided against her. And the only option left for her was to have a jacket and attack on the Supreme Court. That's another problem. The fifth problem is narcotics. Unless you bring narcotics to the war agenda, you cannot address the security challenges of the country. The Afghan narcotics produced $68 billion. 60% of the Taliban war is covered by opium money. The leaders of the Taliban were involved in narcotics in order to get money and fight against the United States, against the Afghan government, and against the international community. And the last point in terms of technically from Afghanistan is a peace deal. A peace deal should happen from a stronger position, not from a weakened position. Cigar last week announced that half of the country has fallen to the Taliban. So these kind of announcements waken us. Why we do that? If that is part of the policies to be developed, that can be discussed without announcing it in TVs and medias and this kind of stuff. So you're encouraging the enemy to come and take part, like take the majority of the country. In terms of the region, the mistakes are that we just look at the battlefield. We are not identifying the sources who fund these insurgents, who support the terrorists from the region. Where are their sanctuaries? Where are their safe havens? That's something that we have to address. How many Taliban and the terrorists were killed in the battlefield? That's not something that you will win unless you go and address the sources. And where are the sources? We went to Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden and kill him. Where Osama bin Laden was popped out?
Pakistan.
That was in Pakistan. He was not found and killed in a remote area. He was not found in a mountainous area. He was not found in a border area, but he was found in the capital, in Abbottabad, next door to the military camp of Pakistan. And we completely ignore these issues. And as long as we ignore these regional aspects, today we are in the 18 years, this will continue to 13 or 14 years. I bet you.
So,
One other point that if I may complete, and then we'll come back to the question. In terms of Osama bin Laden, I have a question for you guys. How if Osama bin Laden was found in Tehran or somewhere else, the entire regime would have overthrown? But the government there is still there, untouched. The United States and the United Nations Security Council blacklisted terrorists. They are actively campaigning in Pakistan. They are political figures. Nobody can say anything. So we really don't know that the countries like Pakistan, is it our ally, like international community, or is it our adversary? And the other part is that we gave the Pakistan $33 billion in a fight against terrorism. And these $33 billion were given to Haqqani Network and the Taliban, and unfortunately they killed 2,400 Americans. Killing Osama bin Laden, that was not a victory. We had to pursue, we had to continue the discussion with anybody that, why my enemy you have kept there? He was not a simple guy. He committed a crime. He killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11. Look, we have to, if we talk like diplomatically, if we talk generally, that does not solve anything. We have to put things very clearly on the toilet table. The Quetta Council of Taliban, where the leadership is there. Quetta is not in Afghanistan. That is one of the largest cities of Pakistan. The mother of all bombs was thrown in Nangarhar of Afghanistan, which is fine. It can identify terrorists and ISIS people. That's absolutely welcome. But when there are openly convoys of Taliban and the Haqqani networks are going in Baluchistan of Pakistan, where are the drones? Where are the bombs? It will not have any consequences for the United States international community. No casualties at all. These are the things that we need to address. The last part, in 2 minutes, if I can summarize, there are problems within international community. There is no one definition of terrorism. Sometimes Taliban are enemy, sometimes Taliban are not enemy. Pakistan supported it. Russia started its connection with the Taliban. Sometimes we are talking with them, sometimes we are fighting against them. China also started a connection with the Taliban. They met a month before in Karachi, their diplomats. Norway housed the Taliban. Sweden housed the Taliban. That's another problem. There is no one common definition of terrorism. What is the definition of terrorism? Any individual or party who create violence among the people, among the innocents, they are terrorists. So are the Taliban doing the same? They are making suicide attacks, they are killing the children, they are attacking on schools, they are attacking the hospitals. They are not terrorists. Why they are not terrorists? Why they are not in the list of the foreign terror group? These are the problems. The other problem of the United States in Afghanistan was that by the time it started war in Afghanistan in 2002, they returned to Iraq. You cannot win multiple wars at the same time. Start one, finish it, go to another one. You cannot be involved in multiple wars. That was another mistake. The third point is that we develop strategies and policies in Washington, D.C., very beautiful strategies, in Berlin, in London, and we are going to execute in Helmand. That will not work unless we have the inputs from the field. If we do not have inputs, and based on these inputs formulate our policies and strategies, these strategies are not successful. The last part is, let's look our benchmarks and our objectives. First, we didn't have well-defined objectives in Afghanistan. What are our benchmarks? If the benchmarks in 2001, 2002 were, number one, to overthrow the terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, wonderful. Today in the state of Al-Qaeda, we have 20 terrorist groups. Number two, to overthrow the Taliban regime associated with Al-Qaeda, Sigar announced that half of the country is fall to the Taliban. Number three, narcotics, 10 times it has increased from 2001 till today.
So all of these answers are deeply related to one thing that I think each of you have touched on. And that is, there is a failure of leadership to think deeply, conceptualize rigorously, and execute in a very consistent way. And I think it seems as though part of the big problem that we have, if we're talking about this sort of anatomy of war and what is not working, is to a certain extent our entire culture that lives and operates in momentary optics and kind of an ADD policy making, right? Whatever's there today, whatever seems right today, and whatever the public will believe or buy, is the direction we should go. That would at least be my takeaway from this conversation. Before we move to questions, in one sentence, I want you to tell me what you think is the problem. No filibusters, because we need to get to questions. What do you think is the big problem? Why aren't we having these conversations? Why aren't we getting to the place where there is leadership, thoughtfulness, alignment, rigorous architectures, deep commitments, public expressions of support? Why do we not do what we're supposed to be doing?
You're asking for volunteers?
I'm asking each of you to tell me what is the one problem in one sentence. If you could fix one thing, what would you
In
ask our
terms,
leaders to do?
in terms of Afghanistan, in one sentence, from the point of view of Afghanistan, if Pakistan was not our neighbor, we would be a very peaceful country.
Hashem, I love you.
From the point of the United States,
Yes.
if we do not address the problem in consultation from the countries, that can be Vietnam, that can be Iraq, that can be Afghanistan, we will not be successful.
So, but why are our leaders failing? Why are they not doing what is there? I mean, John and Jeffrey both said this to me earlier. There are many books that actually discuss our failures. There's a deep well of knowledge in this town. There are experts.
In this room.
And in this room. Why is it not happening?
Well, I'll tell you what I did. On page 431 of my book, is I wrote, with Jeffrey's help actually, at one point when I was drafting the manuscript, 4 commonsensical imperatives that I contend come out of the historical record at looking at all of these conflicts, including Afghanistan, which I deal with tangentially in the book. And it sort of goes like this. I mean, it all sounds very simple. Define a successful geopolitical outcome in keeping with American core interests. Then plan backward. And that, I mean, if you can define some kind of goal clearly enough, you ought to then be able to define a sequence of actions to get to that goal. Doesn't that sound logical? That's one sentence. Another is, if you're going to define a geopolitical outcome, it needs a strategy. And that strategy has to be a sequence of political military operations to get to the end state that you want to achieve. And if statesmen and generals can't do this, or somehow it's unknowable, then whatever you're trying to do is an enterprise that becomes a hostage to fortune and is probably doomed. But if you do get to a strategy, you have to ask yourself then, you need to test it against, can I develop a set of executable plans for this sequence of operations that I want to execute? What kind of resources am I going to need? What kind of a schedule is realistic? And the last thing you want to do is define an exit strategy before it even starts. Because an exit strategy, in my mind, is an oxymoron, at least in terms of our historical experience when we actually won. Because it was only after we won that Americans came home in 1945. And with respect to the execution part, you need comprehensive, whole of government operations and resources that are identified in considerable detail. I submit to you, these sound very reasonable. They sound like a checklist. They sound logical, straightforward, common sense kinds of assertions. And yet they're very hard to do. That's what I had to spend 430 pages before I could really sit down and write these statements and make them credible, sound credible, because they were derivative of the narrative and all the chapters that I wrote before. Otherwise, it would have just been off the top of some guy's head.
So,
Before you recognize Gary,
I will.
Let me give you a long sentence.
Okay, good.
I'll preface that by saying John is a very smart guy, but the things that he wrote are not profound. They're, just as he says, common sense. And you've asked, why didn't we do these common sense things? Okay, so I'll give you some answers in a long sentence, a concatenated sentence. To run a world hegemonic system well and for a long time, you have to be very careful, and you have to be very detail-oriented, and you have to plan ahead for the long term. You hinted that Americans are not good at that. And if you don't do those things, bad things happen. If you look at the way the decisions were made, these very smart people doing very stupid things, you say that the incentive structure was not right, and there were very big institutional obstacles to achieving the kinds of things John talks about, or Rufus talks about, whole government efforts, nation building, interagency cooperation, developing a profound and deep knowledge about other peoples, other languages, other cultures, none of which are part of the current arrangement in the United States. So I think it doesn't happen because America is not organized to run an effective, long-term, hegemonic system. They're not very good at it. To do the simple thing, like mobilizing resources in World War II, we're very good at that. Making objects, we're very good at that. Blowing things up, we're very good at that. But to think profoundly about other peoples and other places in an empathic way is something Americans are poor at. There's no motivation for a leader to promote a constituency which doesn't exist. So I have some questions for you, but you go on.
Well, we have to get to the audience. They've been patiently sitting and listening to this conversation about some of the really structural problems that we have not faced, in either Vietnam, Afghanistan. Your book details very thoughtfully Iraq. And I think that it's certainly time to open up this conversation to the audience. I think we have to start here.
My only question was, comment was, you talk generically about leaders. In this country, the leader is the president. So the question is, why have we had such miserable leadership from a long succession of presidents getting involved in these kinds of operations?
So
What was ever in it for us?
I'll happily answer that.
Good.
Because I am somebody who studies presidents, presidential candidates, our presidential system. And I would argue, and I have argued in both print as well as sort of more recent op-eds, that part of the problem is that we've had two presidents who were very knowledgeable political insiders, who were from two different parties, who served back to back and severely disillusioned this country around what it meant to be a president. Those two presidents were Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And between Vietnam and Watergate, the entire country decided we don't ever want to listen to any of those pointy-headed people in Washington ever again. Because those two politicos were deeply embedded in each of their political parties, had served in many, many offices, had been around. And so really, to a large degree, ever since 1976 and Jimmy Carter talking about how he was a peanut farmer, we have been successfully electing presidents who claimed they were outsiders. And what is even more insane about this logic, from my perspective, is that with each president, we have chosen somebody less experienced or more further outside the system. So we're now at a place where we have a president who doesn't have a respect for, a knowledge of, or an interest in politics, or for that matter, really anything related to war. Machiavelli said very simply, a prince should do nothing but study war. Nothing but that. None of our politicians make that a focus of their interest. Most of them are interested in marketing and messaging and what it means to win the day at the journalistic level. So I would argue that the failure of leadership is also a failure of our public to recognize that experience matters.
I have a slightly different take on that. And it goes back to the Second World War. And we came out of that war maybe justifiably, because we were winners. But we also, somewhere along the line, anointed ourselves the leaders of the free world. I don't know who else did that, but we seem to have taken on that. And that's a huge ego surge to everyone in Congress and the president. Which, of course, we justify by sticking our nose up everybody's butt in the world. Just because we think we know better than they do. And most of these people have never know anything about other civilizations or other cultures. And I think that's endemic in our entire federal political organization.
Oh, I would agree. But that cultural aspect of America does come from what we consider to be the Wilsonian idea about America. That we are this extraordinary country that has developed kind of an incredible democracy, and that part of the mission of our country isn't just to realize the fullest expression of democracy here, peace and prosperity, but in fact to deliver that to the rest of the world. So we do have some problems that have come along with this, but we have also, I would argue, for a long time now, had presidents where we basically didn't like the fact that the pilots drove us into turbulence, and we just keep picking different passengers to pretend they're pilots. And that's something of a public problem, which then gets to this incentive structure. There is no incentive for someone to become deeply knowledgeable or deeply thoughtful or work as hard as Churchill did to try to understand how he could communicate the stakes of the war, the policy of the war, what it really meant to win a war. So I'm going to be quiet unless any of you want to add anything to this, and then go to another.
Gary had his hand up first. He was the first
Okay.
volunteer.
Thank you. My problem with the discussion tonight is that it's so ahistorical, that there is no context established, there's no context established for the idea that the United States should have fought any of these wars, that it had any business in Vietnam or in Iraq or in Afghanistan, that there was any legitimate interest that the United States had in fighting any of those wars. And in fact, I wrote a book, a revisionist history of why and how the United States went to war in Vietnam, which points out that although the excuse or the rationale has always been, well, we thought it was falling dominoes and there was a danger of the communists taking over Southeast Asia, that's not really what's shown by the historical documents that you find in the archives. What it shows is that the United States was totally overconfident, cocky, so cocksure that it thought it could get a cheap victory in South Vietnam in 1961. And then the stakes, politically got gradually higher, and it became more and more difficult for a president to back out. But I think the telling fact that Larry Korb did his doctoral dissertation, interviewed members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who told him that the reason that they recommended that JFK send combat troops to South Vietnam in 1961 was that it would improve the bottom line in the military budget. Now, that's not the total story, but to me, it's indicative of a war that should never have been fought. The United States had no legitimate right to do this. The government that it supported did not have legitimacy in any reasonable way. We put it in power, we kept it in power, we prevented the election to be taken place that should have taken place, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing is true in Iraq. It was all based on lies. There was no reason to have that war. So I'm having trouble here understanding why the discussion is simply on why couldn't we win? I mean, isn't there some relationship here between the fact that we didn't win, couldn't win, and that we had no business being there in the first place?
My good friend Gary, I invited him. I wanted him to ask that question.
There's no consultation whatsoever, I guarantee you.
So we are not up here. John, in his book, let us put it that way, does not say, you should have fought this war, you should have fought that war, you should have fought another one. John wrote this book as a scientist, not as an American citizen. He's a concerned American citizen, but he wrote it as a scientist with evidence. And he said, if you want to do well in this kind of enterprise, and it doesn't just apply to war, it applies to any kind of organized activity, these are the things you have to do. And with that scientific judgment, which is backed up with 400 pages of evidence, you can reach all kinds of conclusions. Now, the people who are running the show in Washington want to know how to do things better.
No.
And there are interpretations about whether we should do that or not, but that's not the question we are addressing tonight. So it's not a fair question. It's not, the implication is unfair to John. I think it's a very legitimate issue, and that's why I phrased my long one-sentence response to there are many ways to become involved with other countries. You can do it for empathic reasons, for noble reasons, for ignoble reasons. But whatever you want to do, if you have a good goal or even a bad goal, you want to do it effectively. This knowledge, just like drugs, can be used for good or ill. And I think it's a very legitimate question. I tried to hint at it, but if I didn't get the point across, I'll be a little more explicit. If you are no good at running a world empire, maybe you just ought to do something else. Okay, now I would like to have 2 minutes, please, to tell you a story, which I've thought about a lot. But I think it's very relevant here. The people who are running the show in the way that you don't like are not interested in hearing from you, as you know, because you haven't done any consulting work lately. And they are quite obdurate about that because there are very big institutional and personal and socio-cultural arguments against listening to any other alternative than the current one. And I'll just give you a little anecdote about something that happened to me because it's a real life experience. Okay, so I wrote the book, which some people I hope have bought outside. There we go. And it was published in 1972. But I wrote a summary even of the 4th chapter, which is the conclusion. So, John studied a lot of wars. They're all case studies. He deduces conclusions. I studied a province over 10 years. I deduced conclusions in the 4th chapter. So I published a short article in May, I think it was August of 1970, it's titled How They Won, How the Communists Won in Vietnam in 1970. Of course, it was before the war, but anyway. And as a result of that, so I was just a graduate student at the time. Nobody knew me. I was just Jeff Race. And so I got a letter from the Institute of Defense Analyses asking me to join a conference on lessons learned in Vietnam. So it was very nice. They flew me down to I drove a car on the Blue Ridge Mountains, beautiful place, and people, the CIA and AID and Army and Air Force, and they're all there. And for 2 days they're talking about the things that we learned, and I listened, a lot of it didn't make any sense. On the second day, they discussed a particular issue. And this, by the way, is all written up in an article, which you can access from my website. And so I raised my hand and I said, the thing that you are talking about now is not going to work. You just have to think about this thing in a different way. And the head of the program, Dr. Chester Cooper, some of you may know him, said, we are not going to talk about that. We are only going to talk about existing programs, and essentially whether they work or not, we're just here to think about how they work a little better. And then he was assisted by a 3-star Marine general, who then stood up and said, I could list in 2 pages all of the things wrong with what we were doing in Vietnam, but if we tell that to the Department of Defense, we will never get another contract. So I didn't argue with them. I just got up, I went out to my rental car, I drove back to the airport, and then DCA and I flew up to Boston, and I wrote an academic article about it, which you can get on my website. Okay, so, and in 46 years, with one exception, which I will tell you about in a moment, I never got another request to be a consultant to the US government. But the exception is interesting. In 1985, Frank Scotland, some of you know him, knew where I was in Bangkok. He called me and said, Jeff, the State Farm wants you to go to the Philippines to write an analysis, spend 30 days, of what are the risks to the American bases in the Philippines. And I've done a lot of work on the Philippines, thanks to the organization now run by Greg Pfeiffer over here. And I was quite well known on that subject. And I wrote a study, and I gave it to Steve Bosworth, and he told me he flew back to Washington, discussed it with the president. And so some interesting things happened, which are also in articles on my website. But the reason I found out later was Morta Bramowitz, who was the head of intelligence research at State, wanted something to be said to the system which he himself could not say as the head of INR. So he essentially hired me and paid me $6,000 for a month to write something. I told him there's no risk at all. It's a guaranteed catastrophe. And so, and in this article, but nobody wants to hear about other ways of doing business which threaten the institutional interests. And that's the thing which the American public must confront.
So again, I mean, it seems to me we're talking about agency, institution and structure, and the problems of leadership and organizational change. But what I want to do is recognize this gentleman who has been
Who bought my book? Yes, please recognize
patiently.
I want to ask you from your book, actually. It's a very important, very first sentence, know your enemy and know yourself.
That's right on the front page, as I recall.
Yes, very front page. And the problem is Pakistan is enemy and America haven't understand yet. Pakistan's enemy, $33 billion. And Afghanistan is not the problem. Who created the problem? Pakistan.
Is this a question?
I'm comments and questions.
Okay.
Coming, yes. And I'm very glad because I spent $15 by Uber and then $79 in 2 books. But I'm very happy after hearing Mr. Hashim that who said that Pakistan is the problem. Really, I come to here to listen that sentence because I want to say this is now America is my country. I'm a citizen now. I'm from the Sindh province of the Pakistan, unfortunately. But Sindhis and Baloch are not happy from the Pakistan like the Afghanistan are. Believe me. And I want to request you, Mr. Jeffrey and Mr. John, please tell the policymaker, operational and strategist, get rid of from Pakistan. Pakistan has a nuclear jihadist bomb problem for the whole world. Believe me, still they don't understand. I created the Sindh caucus in Congress. Adam Schiff, Brett Sherman. These people like we have friends. I'm a policymaker this today in institute. Maybe you are hearing first time the word Sindh. But Sindhis are the friend and natural ally of the America. And the Baloch are, and Afghanistan are. Pakistan is a fake country. My humble request is this, not to write down maybe some other policymaker or be in the CIA or Pentagon operational or thinking about, because Pakistan is playing that game. Laura, please tell to the some people who can write down now a book, because Pakistan is the problem, not the solution. How many, and the China, and this whole things, and the Saudi Arabia, because Pakistan is spreading the nuclear things. Okay,
So-
my question is this, very simple. That from you, as you ask from them in one sentence, how to get rid of from Pakistan?
Well, I mean, I think this question gets to really what we're trying to get at, which is how do we get our policymakers, our politicians to think more deeply or more seriously than they appear to be at the moment? What is the one fix you each would have for our system?
Hashim, you please.
You want me to talk more about Pakistan?
I mean, I understand that there is a specific state policy one way or another. But it seems to me, as we're talking about all of these different wars, all of these different moments, that really what we're talking about here is there's a failure to think deeply enough about our interests, our policies, our strategies, our operations.
In terms of Vietnam, Iraq, and other wars, we have very distinguished experts here. But I would just touch very briefly about, again, Afghanistan, which is my area of work. If I may rephrase your question a little bit, that why the United States, the leaders and the politicians, they are not thinking about Pakistan, is that two reasons. Reason number one, we have to recognize that Pakistan is a skillful, deceptive establishment. They are very good in lobbying and deceiving. That's a fact. Because they kept Osama bin Laden for more than a decade and took money from the United States. The second thing is that the United States think that Pakistan is a nuclear country. If we touch it, then maybe that nuclear atoms will be handed over to the extremism. But that's not the case. You have this bottle, squeeze this bottle, but not to the extent that the water pour. And you can squeeze Pakistan to that limit. And I can tell you that Pakistan will hands up, and they will say that, okay, and we agree, whatever you say. 40,000 of the Pakistani armies were, they couldn't find with India.
Yes.
And they said, okay, it's all you. So, another fact about the Pakistan is that there are 32,000 religious schools. And they are the factories of terrorism. They're just producing terrorists, send them to Afghanistan, send them to Middle East and everywhere. So the terrorism becomes a trade for Pakistan. It's become a business for Pakistan, which needs to be addressed. And the United States, the other problem is that the United States just think today's threat. They don't care of tomorrow. That is the problem. We have to be more cautious of tomorrow's problem and threat than today. That is why, when the Russians were defeated in Afghanistan, they said that, okay, the border is closed, congratulations, come back to Washington, D.C. and left everything back there. That's why we have more than 20 terrorist groups in Afghanistan. So that is another problem. We have to analyze the situation for the future, for our current government people, and for the next generation. And that is the part that the United States never thought about.
So I think we have one last question, and then I know we need to break. And once we break, the good news is each of you will be able to ask your questions individually with the panelists. please.
Carbon allocation?
Yeah. We'll go together.
All right, sounds good.
That's fine.
By the way, who wrote a famous book on Afghanistan?
I did, and so what Professor Race, he may think that he never influenced the government, but actually some people have read his book and have tried to use what he's talked about and have also recommended it again to decision makers, sometimes with success and sometimes without success. So it had more impact than perhaps the two attempts to contract over time. But you
I
said-
wasn't looking for those contracts. but-
Oh, I didn't think you were. I didn't think that at all. And if I could take a swipe at the question a little bit, that you said, what is something that we need to do to change, be better at these things? Well, we have to be more resilient. We have to worry less about problems from the outside hurting us. We should worry less about random terrorist attacks coming to affect us, so that we feel less compelled to get into conflicts that are costly for us and costly for the peoples of those countries. Now, that isn't something that people in the government can easily fix. It's more of a thing that the country as a whole, the nation as a whole, has to decide is willing to accept. And then, having said those pieces, if I could actually ask John, from the Vietnam case, well, what is something that you saw that was working that should have been exploited? So when you talk about, we should have done things better, and I know that obviously we didn't have an end and our means didn't meet the ends, but what is something there that would have been a better course to pursue? It could be strategic, it could just be something small. But I know that Rufus has questions, so I'll let him ask the
Let's
question.
go ahead. So respond to that one.
Well, I'm not the only one who writes about this, but we did create an organization in Vietnam starting in, I think it was 1967, and it was called CORDS. I encountered CORDS people when I got to Saigon in March of 1968. That's an acronym that stands for Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Systems Directorate. I mean, it's a mouthful. And the full thing was MACCORD, Military Assistance Command, Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Systems. And at its peak, it had probably 8,000 to 9,000 people in it, many of them very dedicated and many of them very competent. And probably by then, even a fair number of Vietnamese speakers. This was an interagency organization that worked inside the Theater Command, Westmoreland's, and later General Abrams' organization. There were innovative things that they did. They deployed people out into all of Vietnam, South Vietnam's 47 provinces, and most of the 251 districts. And they had all kinds of relatively sophisticated computerized measurement systems to collect metrics on things, some of which I discuss in the book. A lot of that was pretty innovative, and it had never been tried before. And it went through various stages of leadership, but people who are CORDS veterans, like Rufus Phillips, who's sitting here in this audience, know that we did a lot of very effective and good things because we had people inside the organization who knew how to effectively communicate with the Vietnamese in a way that where they could influence them to do things that we thought were the right things, and they agreed with us. And it was working through this cultural and historical screen that meant we had to be effective with the Vietnamese that could have made a difference. Now fast forward for a minute to a colonel who showed up in L. Paul Bremer's office, who was, I suppose our viceroy in Iraq at one point in the, I'd say early summer time frame of 2003. He had been sent out there by the Pentagon and Donald Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense. A colonel who had had some, apparently some CORDS experience or knew about it, walked into, for a conversation in L. Paul Bremer's office one day and said, "Mr. Ambassador, there were some useful lessons learned that you might want to consider from Vietnam." And, Bremer just explodes at it. and screams at him, "I don't want to hear about Vietnam, God damn it. This is Iraq." And then end of discussion. End of discussion. Almost an exercise in willful ignorance. And yet I can say, sort of in defense of L. Paul Bremer, I think he should have known better in some ways, in the sense that he had been advised by some fairly astute friends. He's a career State Department employee, and one gentleman in particular by the name of James Dobbins, who was also an ambassador, who sort of told him, take a look at the literature take a look at the end game literature that existed at the end of World War II and events since, including monographs that Dobbins himself wrote, where he sort of covered 7 different kinds of military occupations ranging from World War II in Japan to Italy to Bosnia, for example. And it was Bremer's view that perhaps, that what we did in Germany was the gold standard, but not totally. It wasn't totally transferable to Iraq. And I think, actually, Bremer went out to Santa Monica and read some of this literature. Or here in Washington, I'm not sure quite which Rand office he showed up at. But he knew about this stuff. And he even proposed some of the ideas that were in it later on to Donald Rumsfeld, but he got nowhere with it. In fact, Bremer got confused as to who he was working for. Was it Condoleezza Rice, who was at that time, the National Security Advisor under President Bush, or was it Rumsfeld? And there was a famous conversation that went on in the Situation Room, I think, where both of them were pointing at each other saying, no, he works for you, no, he works for you, kind of conversation. So we didn't even have a clearly defined chain of command for Bremer, and yet he was our man in Iraq putatively calling all the shots, but there were people in Washington writing the script, starting with Rumsfeld himself, who I think hadn't done anywhere near enough homework to figure out what the end game should look like or what kind of people should be involved in. That's what I sort of lay out in my book, not based on any original research that I did, but going through the historical record that I found and thought was credible. So,
I could speak loud enough so I think people will hear me. One comment. You can look at Vietnam with whatever thesis you have in mind, and you can go in the historical record and find stuff that will support any position you want to take about what happened in Vietnam. But my question is this, I think what's kind of missing here is we not only need the understanding about what it is that we're involved in, and we can, in some cases, develop what looks like fairly good policy. But where we really fall down is on implementation, because it can only occur by people that we have out on the ground who've been there long enough, who develop local relationships, who can begin to exert some influence, not command, over a struggle which only the local people can win in the final analysis. And it's a people's war. And this is very much a people kind of enterprise. And we're not set up in the U.S. government to think that way. We think organizationally. We think we can put a whole bunch of people out there that don't know anything about, they know a lot about development in general, but they don't know anything about how to get anything done inside of that particular country. And so we really need to revamp our thinking about how we develop a core of people and deploy them in these kinds of enterprises on the assumption that we're going to continue to be involved because in the final analysis we cannot afford not to. And it's not just the safety of the American people, it's also the safety and the prosperity and the well-being of our allies. And if you want to have an example of that, just look at what Syria produced in terms of the refugee pressure on Europe and how that pressure has in turn resulted in Brexit, resulted in all kinds of right-wing populist movements, and a real problem in trying to hold the European community together. So this is a complex situation, but we have to know how to deal with these things. And it's not so easy where you say, all right, we can just neglect that one. We don't have any assets, we can't have any influence. Well, some things could happen there. I mean, the bomb plot, one really big bomb plot came out of Yemen, for God's sake. And so we have to be attentive to at least what's going on and not leave total political vacuums that can be dominated by Islamic terror.
I have 30 seconds to mention something.
Yeah.
Well,
An organizational point about the State Department, we talked about this. You know, their policy essentially is all the diplomats are fungible. You go here for a year, you go there for 18 months, you go 2 years from country to country. You don't have to know anything. It's all downloadable from the database. And I run into this all the time. The level of ignorance is just appalling. The people that we send, I mean, there's some bright spots, but as institutions, they are not organized as a matter of policy to respond to the world that America is in right now. Anybody who can fix that problem, please do it.
Well, Rufus, I think you've got a gentleman sitting on your left who actually is an example of the kind of person you are describing, who possesses the operational skill
Conclusion when I started.
and the background and the capability. And I sort of asked the question, like, I make a couple of statements in my book that Jeffries and Carter's books are sort of generational bookends. Not simply because they have similarly framed titles, War Comes to Long Ann and War Comes to Garmser, but these are books that sort of lay out the experience of people who develop the necessary understanding both of our adversaries and what we ourselves maybe need to do. Carter in particular did that, I think, with his experience in Afghanistan, much, I think, probably to the consternation of his State Department bosses. But I asked the question or throw out the proposition that, you know, in a country as big and complex and rich as this one, wouldn't we be capable of maybe creating 500 Carter Malcassians, recruiting, training, and preparing? Because Carter did it all by himself from everything I read.
And so did I. I learned Vietnamese on my own. The Army never taught me Vietnamese.
So, unfortunately, we can take one more question. I know we're just running
all time.
So, I agree with everything you've said. I think you've summarized beautifully that policy is very important, that currently we're lacking policy big time on everything, including, you know, as summarized by sending troops for 6-7 months to Afghanistan. So I think the overarching thing that's missing is, you know, war has become big business in the U.S., unfortunately. And there's a vicious circle where the money is going from our defense budget to defense companies to lobbyists back into Washington. And that, unfortunately, is trumping policy right now. My question is, how do you think we could make policy trump again and dominate over, you know, war becoming big business?
Well, I would challenge the premise of your question, because when I wrote this, I sort of was saying to myself and to my friends, I'm writing this way the hell above my pay grade. But I had, as a result of being a certifiable member of the military-industrial complex, maybe some useful preparation to think about the issues I write about in this book. But I didn't see any of it in my experience working inside any of these companies as our sort of being in a position to influence policy in any sort of way. I mean, maybe once in a while we might be interested in a particular weapons system procurement, but by and large not. I mean, what was coming to us were a set of engineering requirements to build some kind of a system that the Department of Defense or NASA or one of the military services wanted. But we had no particular influence over the framing of the operational requirement in the first place. That was way the hell above our pay grades. And
There's no trickling up.
even in
policy.
big, huge aerospace
That's
companies,
this.
I mean, when I was at TRW, we were babes in the woods, and we didn't have a clue how we would influence anybody, even if we had had the time and the budget to do it. We just didn't. We just accepted whatever came down and worked on it. I was astonished sometimes, that we would, myself, think about, a particular system and thinking this may not be the best approach, but it's there, we have to bid on it, or we're not playing in the game. But most of the time, we had zero influence over anything having to do
The
with
way we
policy.
conduct war right now is because we do things that we can. We don't do them because they serve a policy. There's no overarching, really, agenda. We say, okay, we're fighting terrorism, but
Well, I think there
what
are,
is that?
but I think Carter's point is really important here. Like, first of all, there are rationales. But secondly, and this is where I think there is such an interesting relationship between the politicians and the public and sort of the military-industrial complex, or the sort of a whole institution of war. And it is this: we keep telling ourselves that our threats are much greater than they are. So we keep scaring ourselves to death, and then we keep deciding that we need to do more and more to protect ourselves against really, really, really low probability incidents. Okay, my favorite example of this, because I just about fell off my chair when I saw it on the morning news one day. If you recall, there was a pilot who flew his airplane into a mountain to commit suicide. And I'm watching the morning news, and the morning news said, that is the ninth pilot suicide since 1979. And then they proceeded to ask the expert with the FAA, do you think we need to do more to test pilot psychology and stability? And I thought to myself, how crazy are we? Okay, 9 pilot suicides since 1979. How many hundreds of thousands of flights are going every single day? How many millions of people have been engaged in sort of the airline industry since 1979? I don't even know. These numbers are impossible. But the probability of that happening to you when you are on a plane is close to 0. So we have this problem where we are, taking every single slip and fall accident into, it's going to happen tomorrow. And that's part of the fear-mongering that is going on among our politicians. We have decided we will accept 0 risk. We want no risk. So if you want no risk and you want perfect protection, then, oh my gosh, we all have to basically have an armed guard around us all the time.
That's an infinite budget that you need to fight that.
So I'll just say this is where I tend to agree. It's the policy-making problem, and it's the political ethics around fear that we're sort of unwilling to confront, and the real costs of war, which we're unwilling to discuss, which is partly how we keep getting into all of these problems. So I know, as I read your book, not being an expert of war or any of these specific wars, what kept coming to mind for me is this is a leadership problem, and a problem of the American public, and a problem of our political leaders. And if we have good leadership, we'll have good war planning. But we have to reverse engineer that.
Thank you very, very much.
No, thank you.
Can we all give a very big hand to all of our